Okay, friends, welcome back. It's been a very full couple of days. This is, I was doing some counting, our 12th session together in just under 48 hours. And we've managed to squeeze in a lot of informal conversations over coffee breaks, receptions, and dinners. And we'll continue that even after the session here. But this is an opportunity with Pankaj and Nesreen to think with you all about where we are in this ongoing process, the Georgetown Global Dialogues, to think a little bit about the themes outlined for this session on culture, politics, and futures for human fraternity, but not to be bound. As you've noticed, we haven't always been bound by the questions and specific topics for a given session, and that's part of the point. To have enough of a framework for a free-flowing conversation, but also to let the conversation go in different directions. I, for one, have been delighted to see how people have spoken in the first person about their own experiences and related the themes to their own narratives as writers. I've found that really wonderful. I'm not going to tell my story, but I found that really wonderful. Just a word to evoke before I turn to Nesreen and then to Pankaj, sort of where we are in the process. As I mentioned yesterday morning, Georgetown Global Dialogues went back to a conversation between me and Pankaj. Paul Eli was there too, more than 2 years ago. And the idea was to use Georgetown as a platform. Georgetown is a Catholic and Jesuit university, but also as a global institution for a new kind of inclusive global dialogue about ways forward in a divided world. And our original impetus, Pankaj and I were just reflecting on this, was sort of US-centered, in the sense that we have a problem in the United States, a very parochial political culture turning inward at a time when more than ever the United States needs to open up, adapt to, adjust to life in a multipolar world where the United States, I'm not using the word we, the United States can't call the tune, has to work with other countries in a spirit of mutual respect. Even equality, it's hard for an American to say that, but imagine that, working with other countries around the global challenges that are the backdrop for our conversation. Transnational issues of war, authoritarianism, inequality, climate change, and of course, as we've seen over the course of the conversation, artificial intelligence coming on like a freight train. When we started the dialogues, and many of you were with us, we had a whole week of conversations in Washington last year. That was sort of the working hypothesis. We need a more inclusive conversation here in Washington, D.C., around the world's problems. And I'd say we were somewhat successful, although it was election season, and some of the conversations the fellows will remember with, let me put it politely, more mainstream thinkers in the United States, really didn't have anything like the back and forth we've had here. It was a little bit frustrating. And because the atmosphere is so poisonous in the United States right now, we decided to do two things, to take these dialogues on the road, so through Rome to Barcelona, and then to Doha over the next year or so, but also to shift the tone, at least for the time being, away from politics and towards culture. Partly in the realization or out of the realization that we want this to be a multi-year process. We know we need a cultural transformation, kinds of things we've been talking about, if not revolution, a word that's come up, and that cultural processes take time, and why not bring writers together to reflect on their work, and why not, and their work and their responsibility in the world that we've been describing. And why not do it in Rome, where Georgetown has good connections with our partner, Antonio Spadaro, the Dicastery for Culture and Education, as a way of opening up a dialogue between the religious and the secular, inspired by Pope Francis, who really personified that openness, with a particular idea of human fraternity, maintaining global humanity as a focus, not just as an abstraction, but it's something he lived out. And if you look at his writing too, Fratelli Tutti, the encyclical we're celebrating 5 years later, it's not a philosophical treatise. There's several sections just devoted to the story of the Good Samaritan. The idea of helping the stranger in need, the idea of fraternity embodied in action. That's inspirational and relates, I think, to his love of literature and his view of literature as a way to, as we've been discussing, expand our imaginative horizons, better understand the suffering, the condition, the frailty of others, our shared human condition, culture and literature as foundations for human fraternity, and his other ideas, social friendship, the idea that friendship has to go beyond family and friends. We have to take risks to engage with people outside our circles, broaden our circle of friends. And then finally, the theme of culture of encounter. Encounter, this beautiful word, which has the word contra within it, opposition. Talk to people we disagree with. Try to find points of contact, respect where they're coming from, engage in those conversations in a spirit of humility. So we brought the dialogues here, and I think we can see the spirit of Pope Francis alive around some of his key ideas. And then we've touched on so much. There's more that I could say. There's some topics I want to bring up in conversation. We have not gone through what we're going to speak about because we want it to be spontaneous. And so with that, let me just, without knowing what Nisreen's going to say, just throw it over to Nisreen and then to Pankaj for some opening reflections.
Thank you, Tom. I have a perverse impulse now to say something completely unexpected and oppositional, but I'm not going to. First of all, I'd like to thank Pankaj and Tom for convening us here and also convening us all, the fellows, again. It has been a really moving couple of days in ways that I have not expected, but also in ways that should have been expected. It's been a very lonely year, and a bit for me, personally, for objective and subjective reasons. My own home country of Sudan has succumbed to a really sharp and precipitous civil war that sent us all out of the country within hours, and we have not been able to return. So I have become an exile, as has my family. And so it's been about trying to get your head around exile, trying to get your head around making a new home, less a physical new home, but more of a mental new home. Where do you find that place of peace and comfort and make your peace and comfort with the fact that you are a permanent exile? But then combined with events in the Middle East in general, Gaza in particular, has also made it a period that feels quite dark, and for which there are no immediate answers. So it's been a time of trying to exist in a space of hopelessness, of lack of certainty, and of no visibility on a future where things work out. But in the middle of all that, I began to think a lot about fraternity, and I began to experience it in my own life and in my own work, and partly because of conversations as well that we've been having over the past couple of months. And I've had a couple of sort of broad themes that I brought to this room, and which I am trying to pursue in the hope that there could be some light at the end of the tunnel. And I'll start with the idea that I think we often think of fraternity, I think, that as something that has been diminished by big temporal events, the decline of the church, industrialization, immigration, travel, the fracture of the extended family because people have had to go off to work. It's always been framed, academically and politically and sort of discursively as something that was always going to happen, right? Once you develop economies and societies and technologies in a certain way, human fraternities will weaken and individual bonds will weaken. And that's just the way it is. But it has struck me over the past few months that fraternity is not something that has just been lost on the way and replaced with something else. It's something that has been dismantled systematically, deliberately, and in a coordinated fashion. And I think there are two reasons for that. Fraternity is expensive, and it is disruptive, and it is oppositional to power and capital. Whether it is fraternity in labor unions, whether it's fraternity in opening up your home and your country to immigrants, whether it is about rent control and building social housing. Once I began to think of fraternity as something that is contradictory or antagonistic to the smooth workings of power and capital, then I began thinking of it as something that has been deliberately framed as therefore related to scarcity. Right? So how you can dismantle the mechanisms of fraternity, but then you also have to dismantle the mental processes of fraternity, which I think are organic and native to us as human beings. And that is something that I have experienced. I had a crash course in cruelty living in the UK through the austerity years, but it was also a crash course in the history of how to dismantle fraternity as a human and mental construct that we're all born with. And the way that happened is by relating fraternity to scarcity. For someone else to gain something, you must lose. For someone to have a home and a roof over their heads that they have not earned, it means you have paid for it. And if you have paid for it, that means you will be poorer and potentially you will be homeless. So the binary becomes more and more extreme, which means that things like the welfare state, openness to the weak, generosity to the dispossessed, seeing other human beings as existing in a world where there, but for the grace of God, go you, has become reversed. And the flip side of it is that there, but for the grace of God, they will go where I go. They will take what I have. And what has that bequeathed? I feel like over the past couple of years, people have been asking questions as if they've woken up from a fugue. What happened? How did we get here? How are we 2 years into ethnic cleansing and a genocide in Gaza? How are we 15, 20 years into the cruelest austerity program in the UK? How are we decades into a post-Thatcher, post-Reagan deregulation that has deposited fewer and fewer benefits for the weak and have created mass inequality? How have we got here where Trump is president again? And I feel like those questions have intensified since Trump won his second term. How do we have deportations where cruelty in the deportations is performative and fetishistic? It's not even the cruelty is the point. It's the cruelty is the fun, right? The cruelty is the payoff. And how have we got to a place where, particularly after the pandemic, blatant and rising and sharpening inequality that is only accelerating? And that happened because fraternity was dismantled. And the answer to how it can be potentially reversed is fraternity. But not fraternity as an alm, not fraternity as charity, not fraternity as a favor, not fraternity that is an indication of how you have grown and become lofty and idealistic as a human being, but fraternity because it's good for you and it's good for everybody. Fraternity has not only a deposit that makes it easier to identify power that does not represent, but only divides and conquers. Fraternity is also natural. It feels good. It gives a sense of congruence, a sense of authenticity, a sense of safety and security on this planet where billions of other people live and you cannot be afraid of them all. And it also gives a sense of volition and agency. And I think one of the reasons that the protests that we've seen in the world over the past couple of years, and how they have actually eventually did include Sudan, which I was quite surprised at. People will say in one breath, Palestine, Sudan, etc. Because the fraternity that people found in how they felt about Gaza and what's happening to Gaza was unlocked something in them that it began to extend to others. And it created a space that reminded me of the Arab Spring revolutions, and particularly the Sudanese revolution, where revolutionary spaces, the physical spaces of revolution, are fascinating because they have their own laws. They have their own laws of gravity. And what happens is a fraternity becomes unlocked that produces so many fascinating, interesting, quirky things. Revolutionary spaces quickly become full of graffiti, become full of music. People bring food, people bring water, because it is natural and multiplying. And people want to feel that because it has a deposit and it has a distribution to them that is non-financial, although there is a financial distribution as well, but that's on the systemic level. So I'll stop there, but I want to end on this note of fraternity not being something that I think we should think of as an extension beyond our limits, but actually something that is core to who we are. Thank you.
Thank you. Pankaj.
Thank you, Nasreen, for these incredibly stimulating thoughts. And I'm thinking as you were speaking that fraternity, or the attempt at fraternity, whether in the Arab Spring or various other episodes, including the attempt to create at least project a sense of solidarity to Palestinians, whether that is also not something that can be or should be related to or should be connected to some political solution or political ideal, because what we are seeing and what we have seen in many other instances where people have tried to forge solidarity or fraternity is the attempt itself is a way of being in the world, is a way of life, and certainly that's how a lot of the great struggles of the last century or so have been devised, have been seen. It's like, again, we're getting away from the instrumentalization of passions, the instrumentalization of selves in the service of some grand political project, but we are, adopting a very basic language, a very powerful, eternal language of solidarity, of compassion, of sympathy, and manifesting that in our daily lives, in our thoughts, in the work that we do. And that in itself is something that is an end, that is not just a means to an end. I want to say something about just sort of try and describe this moment, which seems to me also profoundly ironic. I mean, here we are reflecting on Pope Francis's legacy, an event organized with the help of the Vatican in 2025. It's worth remembering that this modern world that we live in really grew out of a rebellion, a revolt against the church, against the authority of the church, against the norms of the church. And obviously, there were aspects to the authority of the church, the rule, the sort of authority that it often exercised in extremely brutal ways. But there was this sort of, wider sense that once we liberate ourselves from inherited authority or traditional norms, we are on our way to essentially creating a new world altogether, in which collective salvation, or for that matter, individual salvation, would not lie in any kind of religious notions of transcendence. We would achieve transcendence right on this earth, and that we will make a better world for ourselves. And we have increasingly the means to do that. We are making these enormous discoveries in science. We are developing technologies, techniques that will help us master, the earth, exert a kind of domination, control over the natural world, milk its resources, and really, create a world in which transcendence comes from the promise of a better material future. I think it's an extraordinary moment we are in, and I feel like it's worth reflecting on it, that for the first time since the modern world began, large numbers of people, significant numbers of people around the world, and this is, attested, verified by various opinion polls, large numbers of people around the world do not believe that the future is going to be materially superior to the present. So one extremely vital, one could say the central mode of salvation or transcendence has been lost to us. This is this weirdly unremarked fact that, the belief, the faith in which generations of our investors, our ancestors, the idea in which so many of them invested their faith has been lost to us, that we can no longer reasonably tell ourselves that we are heading towards a better future. So many of our ideologies that promised us freedom, equality, dignity have been exposed as essentially fictions of the ruling classes, which managed to beguile many people, and now have been exposed widely as fictions. And I keep saying this, that almost everyone is Nietzsche today, looking at social media and critiquing the fictions of the ruling class, fictions of the liberal elite. So what used to be confined to, a small group of people in the 19th century, examining, reassessing notions of progress, notions of salvation, and finding them to be ideological fictions, is now a universal pastime. People are doing it all the time. So in this sort of context where we've said goodbye, at least the political classes, and to a large extent, I would say, the media classes, have said goodbye to any reasonable hopes of realizing the ideals of freedom, equality, and dignity. Or they maintain this hope, in somewhat deceptive ways. What is prevailing is a very primitive, I shouldn't use the word primitive actually, but a very crude ideology that the strong deserve to rule, and the weak must suffer whatever their fate is. It doesn't matter to the strong. So what I'm trying to say is that the whole promise on which the modern world was created has been exposed as deceptive, and this is in many ways an extraordinary event with consequences for so much of what we do, including writing novels, because the novel, the art form of the novel, it emerges together with this enlarged consciousness of what human beings can do, what they can think. And at some point, obviously, it becomes a very strong art form of a liberal elite, that is a liberal bourgeois elite that is very much invested in this idea of progress, and it becomes a form of self-critique in the best, in the hands of the best novelists. But today, again, we are forced to re-examine our faith in many of the things we do, including writing novels, because it seems like the whole set of assumptions that, underwrote this work, the work of creating novels. And I'm just using this as an example since that, we were talking very fruitfully about the novel and what novelists do. I find that those assumptions of at least some kind of modest progress have gone missing. So as novelists, as writers, as reporters on the world, we find ourselves sort of weirdly exposed and, again, sort of lacking any kind of home, really. And I think this spiritual homelessness, which is endemic, I do not want to, in any way undermine or underplay the actual homelessness that millions of people around the world suffer. But there is this other spiritual malady, which is homelessness, intellectual homelessness, where we so many of the belief systems, so many of faiths that provided us with a kind of home or temporary shelter are in the process of being dismantled if they haven't already been dismantled. And so that, in a way, it calls upon us to do a lot of rethinking. And this event really is an extremely modest gesture in that direction, a way to reckon, first of all, with where we are historically, morally, philosophically, and because all the other ways in which people, the mainstream media talks about these things, rise of China, rise of AI, yes, those are extremely important factors, but I think there is this larger impasse that we must attend to, and that is really the lack of faith in a better future. Having said that, I would also caution against excessive pessimism on this score, because I think what we are also seeing is that even while large parts of the world that have been dominant for an extremely long time and have shaped much of what we think about the world decisively, and that's largely Western Europe and the United States. The crisis today is so severe because these are the people who first became modern, told the rest of us how to become modern, and they are the ones who are struggling the most right now. They are the ones struggling with this loss of faith in their own institutions, loss of legitimacy in their own institutions. But I think too much focus on the political or spiritual problems of once dominant Western nations might distract us from observing that in other parts of the world, different kind of energies are being released, are being unlocked. Large numbers of people are finally entering the center stage of history with their own ideas, with their own experiences, with their own perspectives. And that is why the Global South component of these dialogues is extremely important. Because I keep saying this to my colleagues here, I'm sure they've heard this millions of times and are really bored by it. But the end of the West is not the end of the world. And that our thoughts, our ideas, our perspectives should not become hostage to what is also essentially a crisis of Western elites and their modes of thought, their modes of understanding. They played this enormous gamble on modernity, and it's really resulted in some very completely unpredictable things. But let's not give up hope. Let's not give up faith in large parts of the human population, including those in Western Europe and the United States, who are still maturing, who are still, in a way, who have yet to enter the public sphere with their ideas, with their energies. And our task as writers, educators, is to really look at them and see how we can prepare them, what kind of ideas, what kind of conversations do we want to conduct with them? And I think I'm in my mid-50s today, and I realize, well, that is increasingly the role I should embrace self-consciously, but sincerely, and think, I'm speaking personally here, since so many of you have, so I have license to do that. In that, I've had in many ways, materially and emotionally immensely satisfying career, a career that I never really desired or sought. It came to me, and I'm extremely grateful for it, but I also know it happened in a very different time. And that we are in a new phase. I can keep doing the same things that I was doing before and continue to, reap all the rewards that can come to a relatively successful writer in writing for Western publications. But I'm also convinced that that would not be the right course to follow, and that there are many, many other things to be done now that this rupture has occurred, and that we are in now this new phase of history. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Nasreen, Pankaj. Maybe I'll just pick up on this last point, education, young people, how that fits into our work on this project, and then throw it open for questions, comments, so we can spend the rest of the time in conversation. We started at Georgetown. Georgetown's a university. Education is a long-term project, as is cultural transformation. And one of our 4 goals on reflection coming out of Washington, D.C. was to lift up the voices of a younger generation. We haven't been doing that here, but that's part of the process. And Barcelona and Doha, we're going to dive right back in. We've selected 8 student fellows to join us in Doha. In Barcelona to begin with. 4 from our campus in Doha, 4 from our campus in DC, a very international group, through a competitive process, and working with UDIT and the CCCB in Barcelona. We'll be linking them up with young people there to take up some of the themes we've been working on at our last 2 sessions, and then we'll take that momentum forward into Doha. And I was very happy that Mohsen, you ended our 11th session on a positive note, remarking on the reading habits of your daughter and her friends, that there's a huge thirst for literature that broadens and challenges, that helps to build human fraternity and practice, as Nasreen was saying so eloquently. So we're going to re-energize our conversations going forward with many youth voices. So just a note on that in terms of our process. But let's throw it open for comments, questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. The conversation made me think about the distinction between a competitive urge and a collaborative urge, and to what extent our time is shot through by this competitive urge, that it's not a question of how do we make or buy and sell together well, it's how can I sell the most and monopolize a certain market. Our politics, of course, is really shot through with this now in a very grotesque version of this ultra-competitive, aggressive dialogue that Nasreen alluded to, this desire for, or the pleasure taking in the humiliation and suffering of others. And that a much more collaborative way of organizing things and thinking about these problems is not only generative and interesting, but also goes to this idea of fraternity. And so I wondered whether you could speak more about fraternity in the framework of collaboration. Pankaj, you ended your comments by hinting at a change of course in some sense, or a reassessment. And judging from what you've helped create here, it is a change of course that has great faith in and enthusiasm for the collaborative gesture. And I just, listening to you, I felt so moved because these 2 days have been really an incredible example of the positive, generative, energizing force of the collaborative gesture. So I'm just wondering whether you'd say more about that.
Thank you, Shyam. I think obviously Kamila raised a very important point about literary culture or intellectual culture. I think it's easy to see that the intellectual or literary culture that I've kind of worked in from the 90s onwards, from the late 19th onwards, is quite exceptional in that projects of collaboration, ideas of fraternity have been quite alien to it. And I think, I don't think I'm being unfair in saying that certain ideals of what I would call neoliberal individualism have infected, the practice of literature in very significant ways. So we've really, in a way, I'm not romanticizing the past when I say that, there were certainly more collaborative ventures in the past, not just around translations, but shared political projects, shared, moral projects brought writers together. But the last 3 decades have been quite exceptional in enforcing almost a kind of atomization, a kind of individualization. And so all of us are, essentially brand entrepreneurs setting up our little stalls in the marketplace of ideas and say, please come buy my book. Here's a new idea I'm selling you. Here's my new novel. This is what I say. And of course, all of that is contingent upon the neoliberal economy purring nicely in the background. There you are seeking, and some of its benefits are coming to you. I'm very much a beneficiary of those systems. And I think, perhaps this is what I think, like, it's time for a reassessment to see how much we as writers have also been complicit in this system. And, it's not just a question of feeling guilty about it, but saying, okay, how do we then either extricate ourselves from it, or even within those systems try and create new spaces for collaboration? Because the life of the mind is not something that is there to be monetized. It's there so that we can continuously expand our political, spiritual, intellectual possibilities. And if that is not the main focus, something vital has been lost. And I believe something vital was lost. And so, back to the basics, and back to the idea of critique. The modern world starts with the idea of critique, and we have lost that notion, and we accept too many things passively. We don't challenge them, and so this is a very long-winded reply to your question, but I'm thinking maybe collaboration is something that will employ different parts of my mind, bring forth a different kind of energy. And certainly that something I feel compelled to do at this stage in my career. So collaborative project like this, where writers come together, speak extremely frankly to each other, bare their souls in a way that they haven't done before. And this morning there was an amazing instance of that in Zaid's speech, and I think for me that is a genuinely revelatory moment, where we're certainly breaking free of our professionalized roles, a certain kind of performance that is forced upon us, in proximity to professional institutions or the reading public, and to think afresh about a whole range of things. And something like this, or the publishing projects that Nasreen, Mohsen, and I are involved in, we are doing. I think it's trying to create a new sense of community, new kinds of solidarity.
Very briefly, I've had a much shorter career than Pankaj's, but I think I am lucky in that the calamity came very early in mine, if that makes sense. The epiphanies and the contradictions came very early, and I had to ask myself, what is this for? What is the purpose of this? Is it participating, like you say, in a marketplace of ideas where you're an entrepreneur and you've differentiated yourself? Or is it because there is a purpose behind it? And I think that there is a sense of, just going back to Pankaj's point in his earlier remarks, there is a sense that bore down very heavily of the future being cancelled, right? So all of these investments that you're making in a column, in a book, in a career, in a reputation, in a brand, kind of turn to dust when you see that the future is cancelled. So you have two choices. You can either borrow back into the old paradigm that you now see for what it is, and you start a life of slow but ultimately and surely fatal self-deception and self-soothing, or you realize that you don't really have a choice, right? Yeah, you have to do something different, and you have to do something different with the understanding that you have absolutely no guarantee that it's going to be useful or going to make you feel better or it's going to work, but at least it's not the old thing that definitely doesn't work. And it can be done in parallel to it. It can be done in coordination with it. But something new, or a different way of being, or a different way of thinking, a different way of collaborating has to happen. And I am led in that by friendship. That's the only thing that feels like I can divine the way through it. So as a first principle, are the people your friends? Do you feel that you are amongst friends? That for me is, in the middle of all this uncertainty and sudden darkness, something I can rely on.
Thank you. Thank you. Eche?
This is amazing. Thank you for everything that you have said already. Pankaj, first of all, Nasreen, somebody talked about the wounded healer, and then I didn't notice that you are one of those wounded healers. I always thought that you were in Kenya, just like that. And, whatever. This means that friendship needs to be more genuine, and I'm saying it on my part. I never thought that you are never going back home. So this is just a genuine apology that I didn't notice this, sorry. And Pankaj, I was talking about homelessness, and then you added spiritual homelessness on top of the layers that I counted already. So this new project that is supposed to be home, political home, obviously, Equator, can we also think of it as a spiritual home as well? A remedy for our spiritual homelessness. It's a very dangerous word, spirituality. I know, but still, we need that. I mean, like we try to kind of substitute it with, not substitute necessarily, but heal it with the word friendship. And it's such a powerful word, and I depend on it as well. And I take it as a political anchor, friendship. But still, can we think of Equator as a spiritual home? And or what do you think when I say, is it a spiritual home, Equator? Would it be a spiritual home?
Nasreen?
Well, it's directed towards you, so I'll go after.
I actually
Well, it's
probably
both of you, by the way, because you're doing it together, obviously. It's for both.
Yeah, we can both answer.
we shouldn't probably start our PR campaign for Equator on the platform of Georgetown Global Dialogues. But I would say yes, to your question, absolutely. I mean, I certainly don't see it, or nor do I see this as any sort of conventional professional institution, organization, or investment. This is really, in many ways, a way of conceiving and forming a community,
Yeah.
a movement. Small scale, nevertheless, strong, powerful source of comfort, ideas, solidarity. So the projects are congruent and sort of coincide in many important respects.
Yeah, I think I come back to this notion of the future because it's the space I inhabit these days, which is a sense of sort of something being truncated abruptly, or an arc that suddenly is much shorter than you thought it was. Writing in all its forms, because I am here to fight for the rights of the nonfiction writer as well. Writing in all its forms is kind of an investment in the future, right? It is, or at least assumes that a future is going to happen. And going back to Gaza again, the sense of a future being switched off so quickly, so vivid to me in the beginning, and there was a corollary of that to Sudan and in Sudan. And writing is assumes the future is going to happen. Living assumes the future is going to happen. Befriending, everything assumes that there is a kind of timeline. You have some time. And to me, writing is an investment in the future, an assumption of a future, but also a celebration, a lingering, an imagination. It implies that you kind of have a lot to play with, You have time to sit and linger and reflect and describe. You have time to imagine. You have time to hope. And you have time to describe yourself and your surroundings and the people that are in your life. And to me, this new phase, which I now realize sounds like something out of a Marvel movie, but it's actually an evolution as opposed to a kind of new regime. This new phase that I hope for is one where we do not become dispirited by these cancellations of futures, right? Do not stop writing. Do not stop imagining. Do not stop lingering. Still understand that we have these privileges and luxuries to take back our description and our perspective of ourselves and to call reality what it is. To describe reality, I think, has become a really rare and revolutionary thing. These things that in previous times seemed obvious, now to me seem very vital and very urgent and very, I hate the word empowering, but very empowering or instilling agency and choice. Choice, I feel, is something that has been really effaced. The fact that we all have a choice to a certain extent. Particularly people like us who are privileged with careers, we have a choice. The choices do not have equal results. But in human life, as adults, we take paths, right? And I think there's this oppressive sense, which I alluded to in my earlier panel, this oppressive sense that things are how they are because that is how they are, not because anybody made a choice. And when you make a choice, you are disrupting this whole paradigm that we are just on this road to the inevitable. And so I just want to be around people that I can say to, you have a choice, you have the right, you can linger, you can describe, you can imagine, even though you have come of age or are coming of age in a world where you don't think you have a future. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm tempted to keep the conversation going here, but as I mentioned earlier, I think we also enjoy and gain so much from more informal interaction, and we have a reception waiting for us. So maybe I'll try to draw things to a close, coming back to how honored Georgetown University is to be collaborating, to use Hisham's beautiful word, on a project like this, which is so open-ended and a bit unusual for a university. Universities are under siege, as you know, in the United States. There are lots of self-inflicted wounds within university communities. I think of disciplines that have become hardened and don't even talk to one another. And then the lack of communication, fellowship, and social friendship, if you like, outside the university with the wider intellectual world. So I think this project is an example of a beautiful collaboration of that kind. And speaking on behalf of Georgetown, we're really grateful to our partners here at the Dicastery, to you, Pankaj, in your leadership, Nesreen, all the fellows, for your friendship and your solidarity as we work together and continue this process, this dialogue into the future.